Great. Good morning, everyone. Sven Schneider. I'm a member of an advisory group supporting the German Foreign Office on their integrated peace engagement worldwide. So by way of introducing this panel, I think it's worthwhile to quickly talk about the notion of, what you said, what is a community security actor? It's fair to say it's not you. The fact that communities mobilize to protect their own members has been around forever. But the role these groups play has changed quite dramatically over the last years. They play an ever more important role in the security provision of their communities. So in terms of numbers, there are more and more of these groups. The specific tasks they take on are far more diverse, and the spectrum of those groups has become far more varied. So from independent groups ranging to groups aligned with government actors, but also links to organized crime, terrorist groups, and a range of other actors, being external other governments or and other groups of actors. So the question is very much about they form an integral part of the hybrid security arrangements of those communities. So much so that 2.5 years ago, we looked into a very particular manifestation of these groups. So we commissioned Henry Smith and his team to look into groups that work hand in hand with governments on security in those communities, which we call, one of these acronyms, government-affiliated security actors. And the point being, those groups won't go away. So we better deal with them and understand them better, for which we need more evidence and research. And this panel looks at, one of those elements, better understanding of what does it mean to exit those groups and to develop a more effective pragmatic response to those groups. There's various questions we need to address, just raising some of them. But what does it actually mean for those individuals who exit these groups? What does it mean for those communities? What does it mean for local security as a whole? But also, what is the exiting process? Is it formal, informal? Is it a case of you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave? Or what are the actual opportunities we have if people start, or if individuals start to exit these groups? So I'm looking forward to our panel to start addressing those points and then raising some key questions and issues we then can take with us to the working group to find more specific options how to address these things, what can we do programmatically and also policy-wise. So I'm handing over to Mohammed, who will be the first panelist to talk. Doesn't need introduction. We have had the privilege to talk, to listen to him yesterday as well. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mohammed Bukar. I am MEAC Northeastern Nigeria Field Research Coordinator, and I live and work in Maiduguri, which is also in Northeastern Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and I'm so happy to get a chance to present with you together today on some of the research we've done in the northeast of Nigeria. We will first present a little bit on the different community security actors that we're doing research with in the Northeast, as well as the roles they play, and we'll reflect a bit on recruitment as well. And then we'll focus mostly on exit pathways and the reasons why people are exiting these groups while the conflict is still ongoing. And we've tried to highlight some quotes for you as a way of giving respondents a little bit of a chance to tell their stories directly. So in our surveys, we currently have a sample of over 700 individuals who've been with one of these community security actors in the Northeast. About 7% of the sample has been with more than one group, so you'll see that the totals of current affiliates and former affiliates doesn't really add up. But so just to say that more than half of the respondents are still with these groups today. So it's our hope that we can follow them for a few more years and see what happens. Roughly 1/3 of the sample was recruited for the research directly by us to our different surveys, and then 2/3 came to us through partnerships with different UN entities. So for example, we interviewed a group of affiliates who were in a UNDP program and received training, and we interviewed half of them before they received the training and then half of them afterwards so that we could see what the impact of the training was. And then we've also worked with UNICEF and Search for Common Ground during a program they were providing to children who were leaving these groups. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Mohammed now, who will talk a bit more about who these different groups are.
Thank you, Kato. To get right to it, since the conflict started, the Boko Haram conflict in the northeast of Nigeria, communities in the region have come together to form militia groups to protect themselves. And these groups have different levels of centralization and cooperation with the government. And one of such groups is called the Yangora, which in Hausa translates to people with sticks. This is because sticks, clubs, and cutlasses are all the weapons that they have. And in an effort to restructure them into a more formal outfit, the government of Borno State started absorbing them into what is called the Civilian Joint Task Force, which is also referred to as the CJTF. The CJTF has a clearer leadership structure, and many of their members have membership cards, and some of them even receive monthly salaries. And even then, however, the Angora does still exist and operate alongside and in collaboration with the CJTF. The difference between the CJTF and the Angora is not always clear, so sometimes people are confused the two. There are several other community security actors too. There are the hunters and charmers, for example. They use their hunting skills and their reputation for wielding magical and supernatural powers to protect their communities. They existed before the Boko Haram conflict, and they traditionally protect communities from threats like armed robbers and cattle rustlers. In fact, many of them had to lay low and withdraw from their normal activities during the onset of the conflict because they were seen as a threat by Boko Haram and were specifically targeted. From the pictures displayed here and the previous slide, you can see that sometimes these groups wear uniforms and carry advanced weaponry. However, often they only use sticks and locally made bows and arrows. And I took a picture of my father's bow and arrow there to show you how basic it is. It is not the case that all CSAs are professionally trained and professionally outfitted security actors. Rather, it is a mix of people who have different skills and experiences. Next slide. Communities often mobilize together, and community leaders urge others to join these groups. Even though many of those we spoke to wanted to join the groups to try to protect their communities, many others said they didn't really have a choice. Some explained they had to join as a result of attacks on their communities, and some indicated that they were pressured to do so. Usually, this pressure comes from other community members and elders. Sometimes people have to join to demonstrate where their loyalties lie and to avoid being seen as Boko Haram supporters and enablers. Additionally, they were instructed by the military to join to help them fight the insurgents. This quote right here highlights this particular situation. And also on a more personal note, I myself have been in that particular situation about 10 years ago when the Yangora started first emerging. I, as well as other young people in my neighborhood, were pressured to by community members and family members to go out and start patrolling the neighborhood. And for a few weeks, I was going out to patrol armed only with a flimsy piece of stick. And I really, really didn't want to do so. But I was very lucky. After a couple of weeks, I was able to stop. But for many others, there are several neighborhoods in the region that the pressure to do that, to go out and patrol, really persisted for quite a while. The roles of these groups keeps changing and shifting over time. For example, in many communities, they are not completely security related anymore. Unsurprisingly, CSAs often end up assuming the roles of the police and the military in their absence. They sometimes help the police and the military in navigating unfamiliar territories and act as language interpreters. Their other well-known roles include setting up checkpoints, patrolling communities, and going on patrols with the military. They have, however, now evolved to other roles as well, like resolving domestic disputes, policing petty crimes in their communities, and providing security at social events. They also try to regulate social and gender norms. They will cite religious and cultural values as motivation to do so. For example, in some neighborhoods, they impose curfews on women and girls and try to force them not to leave their homes on their own. And lastly, these CSAs are widely known to be involved with politicians and help them in achieving some of their political goals.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thank you for sharing that personal story with us. I think we'll now shift a little bit to thinking more about the exit expectations and pathways. And I know many of you have seen this slide 2 days ago at a high-level panel, but I just wanted to highlight this again because we really thought this was quite surprising. The fact that more people who are with the CJTF think it's not possible to leave when they are with the group than those who are with Boko Haram. And I think this highlights that as long as the conflict is ongoing, many can't exit these groups because their communities are still under attack, and so they feel like it wouldn't be safe to leave. We also asked people to tell us in their own words how and why they left, that is, those who had already left the community security actor. And so we pulled some of these answers to run you through them, and hopefully this is insightful for maybe what might happen with some of these groups in the future.
Thank you again. So obviously, not everyone is leaving these groups. Many people just take up weapons and lay them down, depending on how much better or worse the conflict is. As long as the conflict continues, this will probably keep happening. For example, if schools and markets reopen and farmlands become accessible again for farming, people will, of course, have jobs to get back to, and many affiliates don't receive any salary or any payment at all. So any availability of an income-generating activity will be welcomed. The Borno State government has tried to formalize and professionalize some of these groups. And many people moved between groups depending on what was being offered. We are seeing in our responses that this process has not been considered fair, and people are frustrated for being left out. But there are those whom the experience is the opposite. They get additional benefits and are therefore deciding to stay. Some respondents also point to the pride that comes with moving from the Angora to the more professional CJTF. And as it is often the case with these kinds of groups, many hope to be able to move into more formal careers, such as the police and the military. This is tricky because there is often not enough capacity to absorb everyone, and many lack the required skills and education to join. Several international organizations have offered programs, and we can see in our responses that indeed this makes a difference to people. And UNDP, for example, has offered skills and training and capital to help people to start up businesses. Next slide. Some people leave because they disagree with the tactics of the group or its purpose, which involves involving in politics. Interestingly, in the open-ended responses in our surveys, we get a lot of stories from affiliates who are uncomfortable with the indiscriminate violence committed, sometimes by these groups. We ask general questions that ask what people disliked most during their time with the groups. And the torture and the killing of community members is regularly mentioned. When we asked how and why people left, this is also a reason that sometimes comes up. Some respondents highlighted that they left the group because other members of the group were taking bribes or because they got involved in politics, and this was not something they supported or were comfortable with. This behavior has in some cases ruined their reputation as protectors and saviors, and this is a reputation they garnered during the early years of the conflict. And now in some communities, they are just barely tolerated, and they seem to have outlived their usefulness. I would like to remind you that even though some people really wanted to join these groups, many others did not do so willingly. It is unsurprising that these people will leave the moment they get a chance to do so. The reasons I highlighted in the previous slides might change over time, and of course, if the conflict ends, the picture will change. I hope that highlighting why some people are leaving these groups now will provide some insights on how these groups will look like in the future. I will now hand you back to Kato, who will conclude the presentation.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. So just very briefly on girls and women, and I really thought the previous panel was so excellent, and I wish we had more time to dive into this a bit more. But just to say that, like boys and men, women often join these groups for a variety of reasons, including their own protection and their own security. And I was, I think, struck by something you were saying, Sajad, yesterday about the benefit of freedom of mobility that comes from being with these groups. And that's something that women sometimes also highlight. Someone told us that she joined because that way she could go and fetch water whenever she wanted without being bothered, for example. And we did some focus groups with girls and women who are with these groups or who were with these groups, and this was together with Dr. Marks, and she already highlighted some of the excellent work she did with us. And so these women described activities that they were doing for the group that went beyond just protecting their communities. So, for example, counseling children who don't listen to their parents, or counseling women drug abusers, giving marital advice, keeping an eye on how girls are spending money in the market. And so it really stands out that these women who are with these community security actors are often defying gender expectations, and they are facing stigma because of it. For example, just because of the sheer fact that they wear pants as part of their uniform. They are sometimes called names. And they also, on the other hand, do report that their work really allows them to have some sort of autonomy and empowerment that they would otherwise maybe not be able to get. So, for example, one woman told us that she had always wanted to join the police, and she couldn't, but she could join a community security actor. Mohammed talked a bit about this, but beyond just considering the women and girls with these groups, we also just need to consider that these groups are reinforcing certain social and gender norms. And so when thinking about programming for these groups, whether it's to formalize them or to offer off-ramps, this is something we have to take into account. I know we're really running out of time. Thank you so much for bearing with us. Just very quickly, a few final policy reflections, and I hope we can go into this a bit more during the workshop session. But just to again reiterate that peace might lead to some of these groups standing down. Others might transform. Some of these people will stay in their communities. Others will go elsewhere. The point here is that there's not really a barrier between being in and out of these groups, and so they may quickly remobilize again if things change. And between the stories of coerced affiliation and witnessing and committing violence against community members, it's really important to flag that many of these people might be dealing with trauma that needs to be addressed. I already said it, but the demarcations between these groups are blurry, as is formal membership, and that really complicates any efforts to kind of formalize them or offer off-ramps. And then lastly, just to reiterate again that girls and women really should be a part of any programs that work with these groups. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Kato and Mohammed. First of all, showing again, the broad perspective MEAC has on conflict, but also helping us to understand what it means to exit groups like Jiyad. So allow me to hand over to Sajad, who also does the introduction, also helped us to understand Iraq, the context in Iraq yesterday. So please go on.
Thanks, Sven. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to focus on the exit part of the question. Like, what does exit mean for people, specifically those in the groups affiliated with the PMF? So yesterday I made clarification that the armed groups that we deal with in Iraq are two types: the ones that are either ISIS or affiliated with ISIS, or their precursors like Al-Qaeda, or the second, which is mostly affiliated with the PMF, which is the Popular Mobilization Forces, the majority of whom were created post-2014 in response to the rise of ISIS. So my research is mostly focused on the second type of groups, the groups that are part of what is called the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF, which is now recognized by the state as one of the components of the state security forces. So the PMF is in the same standing as the army and the police and the regular armed forces. And they're entitled to the same privileges, they're under the same operational control. And so their categorization is markedly different from what we would expect when we hear the term armed group, as something that is sort of on the borders of being legal. The PMF groups are legal and legitimate, both at the same time. The issue, the problematic parts of the PMF are the fact that not all their members are enrolled in the official PMF commission. So the group is recognized by the PMF, but let's say they have 25,000 members. 20,000 of those are registered and receive salaries, and they're card-carrying members that are recognized by the state. But then a few thousand of them are not registered in the PMF's payroll, but yet have access to the same legal status and ability to move and so on. That element is the most problematic for the government, and it's been the most difficult for them to deal with, and this is an ongoing issue. Generally, when we talk about exit, in the case of the PMF is around 60 groups at this moment and likely to increase as well. It's just over 100,000 members in total. Groups are being formed sort of every year, an extra group or two. Some are splintering into two separate groups. The Yazidi Self-Defense Forces in Sinjar have registered 4 groups of the last 3 years. So they themselves are now recognized by the state as official legal forces. So when we talk about exit, I would say, according to sort of some of the studies that we've looked into, 90% of exit from these armed groups is involuntary. People not wanting to leave the groups, but being forced to leave the groups. Only 10% of the exit is actually voluntary. Whether it's voluntary or involuntary, exit is viewed negatively by the person who leaves the groups, by the community where that person resides, by the group themselves. So exit has very negative connotations. The PMF itself, in each of the brigades, each of these groups, has sort of a counter-demobilization office. A lot of it is ideological or religious. It's really to keep people's morale up and to promote people remaining in the groups. So they themselves counter the idea of demobilization. And if we want to talk about DDR, it does not apply as a general policy to the PMF, because you wouldn't apply it to the police or the army, would you? So the same thing to the PMF. So what we have to look at is what happens after the people exit the groups, whether voluntarily or involuntary. So the first thing that happens is, if it's involuntary, most of the time they lose access to their salary. So then they have to go through an application process of applying for what they call the pension. And this can be drawn out. It can last over a year, sometimes much longer. And if somebody's lost their income, you can imagine the pressure immediately if they're the sole earner in a household. they lose the status. They are no longer card-carrying members of the PMF. They don't have the same legal status, the ability to move freely, for example, and all the other privileges they lose as part of the PMF members. So the demobilization is discouraged. Now, the voluntary exit, the 10%, usually it's to do with some of the issues already raised. So people complain about how they're treated in the PMF. They're sent to do tasks that they don't want to do. They notice corruption, for example. They're not happy with their group's particular, power status in that area or this territory. They may move to another group, actually. They have some freedom to do that. It's discouraged, but they're able to sometimes maneuver that. But on the involuntary side, it's mostly injury. People who can no longer carry out their roles physically. Loss of limbs is the most common thing. Loss of sight is very common as well. Those people who leave involuntary are the ones who are most determined to get back in if they can. They suffer the most when they leave because they don't feel the state is able to take care of them. And the pressures on their family is immense. If they were the sole earners, they lose their income until they get their pension, but also now they are essentially seen as a liability. So their family has to care for them, especially those who are not able to be mobile easily. Loss of limbs is a big problem. So you can imagine the pressure that puts on the rest of their families. So some have elderly parents looking after them. Mostly it's their wives who then have to deal with the children and the adult who is now injured and try to find a source of income. You can imagine the pressures that families come under. So that is why it's extremely unlikely that someone would want to leave the PMF under any circumstance. The other reasons for involuntary demobilization, apart from injury, is delays in salary. And some of this is due to sometimes corruption. We have a problem with salaries being delivered by cash, and commanders are obviously sometimes engaged in corruption. And then people's salaries are delayed. Sometimes they just feel that, I can't keep carrying on in this situation. And that is seen as involuntary. They don't want to leave, but because they're not earning, they need to go somewhere else to make a living. Internal conflict is also an issue. Sometimes between the groups, the rival commanders decide to weaken another side or another element of that group, and that means some fighters are demobilized involuntarily. Discipline issues. So in the past, particularly in the periods 2014 to 2016, there was around 20,000 members of the PMF who went AWOL. When the battles were really tough against ISIS, they just stopped showing up, they sort of absconded, and so their status in the PMF was terminated. Since 2017, there have been protests by these group of people. They call them al-mafsukha uqudhum, the people whose contracts have been terminated, who've been desperate to get back into the PMF. And some of them have, and more will, I suspect, be added back to the payroll in the coming time. But it shows you that even when they decided to leave the PMF, there was still a big urge to get back in as soon as the conditions were more favorable. I would say that mass demobilization is probably never going to happen for the PMF because it's recognized as part of the state security. I would say that in communities, when people approach to discuss the issue of demobilization, there is a lot of apprehension about what that means and what is the effect. So if my husband or my son leaves the PMF, what does that mean for us? Usually it means loss of income to people and loss of status. So that is also seen with suspicion. So if a UN agency is going in saying, we're going to support demobilization of the PMF, you can imagine there'll be a lot of negative reaction. And at the brigade level, even within the PMF, the demobilization is something that is actually countered by the groups. They don't want to promote the fact that their members are considering demobilization or to allow anybody to come in and approach the issue of demobilization. So by and large, the PMF is here to stay. It's going to increase in size slowly, and the number of groups will increase. But I think the best thing that we can do in terms of maybe giving some recommendations or being positive in some sense is to help plan for those that do leave. When they do, what can we do to support their journeys? Whether they leave voluntarily or involuntarily, especially those who are forced to leave through injury. What can we do to make their journeys and their lives easier? So that maybe in the future, people say, hey, there is a life after the PMF. If I do leave, there is somewhere else I can be. In the future, if a government is more empowered to reduce the size of the PMF or to prevent further groups forming, then at least their members can say, well, there's a possibility to have a decent life. So support for people's journeys after exit, I think, is the best thing that we can think about, particularly those, like I say, who are subjected to loss of income, loss of status, injury, who need rehabilitation and services. They really struggle. Some of them have been waiting for a year, for example, for surgery. some of it is not available inside Iraq and they have to travel abroad. They're waiting for the government to arrange this. And it destroys their confidence. The mental state is awful. The burden on their families is huge. If we can have some sort of programming that not encourages people to demobilize, but makes it so that if you are demobilized, you can still be a successful member of society. So skills training, physical rehabilitation, things like that. Then I think in the future, it makes this less of a risky journey to be demobilized. And that's probably what I would look for. But right now, the idea of exit is seen negatively in communities in Iraq. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sajad, for this very interesting presentation on what it actually means to leave the PMF in Iraq. May I hand over to Vanda, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and expert on armed groups.
Yes, so good morning. I'm Vanda Felbab-Brown. I direct the Initiative for Non-State Armed Actors and Illicit Economies at Brookings. And I have worked on the issues of defectors, DDR, and militias around the world, in Afghanistan, Somalia, Nigeria, Iraq, Colombia, but also places like Mexico, that is not a place of armed conflict, but where the intensity and form of violent criminality is really on par with the way we think about civil wars or insurgencies in other parts of the world. So let me kind of pick themes that I think run across some of the cases and think with you about what exit means for individuals or when individuals decide to exit, and the far more challenging case when entire organizations are in fact removed in some form from the battlefield and what that means. And I want to return to what Siobhan started this panel with, namely the controversial issues of names. I will mostly refer to the groups as paramilitary groups or militias, and specifically not use the term community security providers, because they might provide some aspects of security, but they very frequently provide a lot of insecurity, both to the very community where they operate, but also to other communities. And also, are they really community actors? Well, in some African cases, we are really thinking about tribal or clan militias. But very frequently, these actors are instigated, organized by politicians, businessmen, and or government actors. And I'm also not going to use the term government-affiliated actors. Sometimes they might be on government payroll, but sometimes they simply oppose a rival group with really very remote connections to the government, and sometimes even equally disliking the government as much as they refer the rival. Finally, I want to highlight one aspect that we were mentioning throughout the past 2 days, which is that even the groups that we think of as the brutal evil actors, the terrorist-designated groups, Islamic State in West Africa province, not necessarily Boko Haram, but the splinter group, or ISIS, even as they are brutal and provide insecurity at large scale, they might also provide some forms of security to particular segments of community. We heard about some of these groups providing justice that is far more effective, far faster, if brutal and unaccountable in some ways than the government does. So really what is insecurity, what is security is very fluid, both for the opponents that we are talking about on the panel and for the actual sources. So in what way do the paramilitary groups provide insecurity? I won't say in what way they provide security, that's the more obvious element. Well, they are often not equal in their treatment of different ethnic, clan, tribal minority groups. In the case of the Hash al-Shabi that we just heard, they might be very brutish towards Sunni communities, even as they protect, for example, Shia communities. They take it upon themselves, as we heard about CJTF, to enforce their interpretation of social rules or religious rules, but they might do it in a manner that is seen as very intrusive. On the one hand, they might be called upon by elders, as we heard in the Nigeria case from Fatima and others, but they also often challenge the bulamas, they challenge the imams, they take authority upon themselves to say that their rule now is the right rule. the ability to hold arms, to have the prestige that we heard about, generates a desire for power. They get political power, social power, and physical power. And the political power often becomes connected, instrumentalized, exploited by a politician. So this is very common, whether we're talking Colombia, Afghanistan, Indonesia 2 decades or 3 decades ago, or the current cases that we are looking at. And so they also get a lot of economic power, not just in the dream scenario for this group of the pro-Iranian, particularly the pro-Iranian segment of the Hashd al-Shaabi becoming recognized, of the PMF becoming recognized as an official security branch with an extraordinary budget of close to 2 billion, and on top of that, its own economic corporations of even far greater resources. That's kind of the dream scenario that many of these groups want, but rarely get. But they get economic power by forcibly monopolizing legal and illegal economies and limiting access. And that, of course, is what draws many members in and keeps them to stick in those groups. They have this privileged access to economic resources amid conditions of paucity and limited opportunities. So all of that means that by and large, they do not want to go away. And even though the insurgents, the militants might be forced into DDR because they were defeated, or ultimately their conditions of insurgents are so difficult that they defect, or there is a peace agreement, these groups really don't want to go away at the group level. At an individual level, there might be reasons to exit. We heard about them, personal experiences that are by and large negative. Or perhaps a small network that exits, that pulls individuals out. But at the group level, it's pretty hard. They also don't want to be subjected to any kind of transitional justice. Yet they have often perpetrated equivalent abuses, at least in terms of character, if not in number, and sometimes in number, as the insurgents or the criminal groups whom they fight. So when does it happen that they exit at the group level? Well, often there is actually a forced element, or there is a threat that's hanging over them. So groups that are thoroughly defeated, or that they make the calculation they simply no longer have the capacity to be challenging the existing authority. So the various anti-Taliban militias have simply melted away when the Taliban won because they were not capable of resisting the Taliban. In the case of the Autodefensas de Colombia, the reason why the leadership agreed to the very sweet peace deal that it got under the Uribe administration was that their leaders were fearing extradition to the United States on drug trafficking charges. And the ability under Uribe to portray themselves as political actors and avail themselves of the peace deal allowed them, or the hope of avoiding extradition. Some of the top leaders were ultimately extradited. Now, when the groups talk about exiting, they say, well, we will exit if we will get legal livelihoods. Now, we're talking about groups that often have tens of thousands of members in the conditions of poverty and paucity. The state, the international support programs never provide this level of jobs. They might provide some level of training, but there is a significant difference between training and actual jobs. So even if they get the training, they face this enormous uncertainty. So what they then hope to do is to make a deal to be recognized as state actors and to never go away. So it might not be that they will, like the PMF, become a formal branch of the government, but they will want to be the local traffic police. They will want to be the local religious police. They will want to be the local paramilitary force that the state provides some money. Now, you might think that this is benevolent, but it actually isn't, because even the official status does not remove them from the illegal activities they were participating in. And it can also provide enormous burden on budgets. Is it better if they are somewhat formalized? I would say yes, because that at least provide the option of at some point moving toward subjecting them to shaping their behavior and subjecting them to some level of accountability. So by and large, it's really better if these groups do not emerge, and it's really much better if the state does not encourage their formation. When they do, they tend to stick like glue. It's really hard to get rid of them, and over time, they create more and more problems. And rather than focusing on demobilizing them, completely removing them from the battlefield, the only option often is simply shaping their behavior toward less pernicious activity. There are a set of tools that we can talk about later about how to shape that behavior.
Great, thank you so much. Showing the diverse nature of the armed groups you're talking about and the challenges in dealing with them. Allow me to pass this on now to Henry Smith, the director of First Call Partners, to bring this all together and show a pathway to the workshop afterwards.
So that's a poison chalice, and I won't succeed. So apologies in advance for failing to do what Sven has just set me. Thanks very much, Sven, for inviting me to the panel. Thank you, Siobhan, for inviting us to this conference. I mean, we're a late entrant, I suppose, into the MEAC world, but very, very happy to be part of it this time. Just maybe to share a couple of words about what we are, what First Call is. I hope my colleague and I are here today. So we're not researchers in the sense that most of you are. Most of our work looks at trying to translate evidence into action, the policy or program action, mostly for bilateral actors, some UN agencies. So we're not really coming at this from a pure research perspective, more the perspective of the kind of desire, for those of you who've been in the government kind of side of things, the desire to be doing something. You need to respond in some way. So it's trying to think through some of the options for that response. And so my experience, I mean, is much lighter than the colleagues on the panel here regarding Iraq and northeast Nigeria. It's great to be on a panel listening to people who really know their business. It's a privilege to do so, actually. My experience in Iraq was working for the British Embassy, and my experience in Nigeria has been supporting security programs in the northeast. So I come at it from a slightly different perspective. But actually, a lot of the points that have been raised in the discussion just now are things that I can definitely recognise from experience of kind of doing things in a bit more of a practical way. Just to give you a couple of minutes on the work that Sven had tasked us to do a couple of years ago. This was about 2 years ago, I suppose now, and it was, I guess, a recognition that what Sven would call government security actors, so definitely a problem with or an issue in terms of terminology, but we'll come to that in a second, are a phenomena, and they're a reality on the ground, and from the perspective of a bilateral actor, there's something that one needs to think through when trying to understand how to engage in a conflict context. So that was a kind of background. And our task was, is there something that's specific about government-aligned security actors, which is different, for example, from community security actors or vigilante groups or armed groups? And we could easily argue all day about terminology. I mean, it's absolutely, you're right, absolutely, that these things mean different things to different people at different times. But I think what we identified was that there is a specific set of characteristics which are around the relationship that a group has with government, which are quite complicated. They're often integrated but not legally accountable. They're often aligned but not necessarily politically. It's often temporal, just for a period of time during a particular phase of the conflict. But the funny thing is that it seems that, the reality is that it seems that these groups are an integral part of the security response on the part of the government to the conflict that it is engaged in. And therefore, a party to the conflict and an actor with whom one needs to engage. So that was the kind of background. The motivations Sven has talked about before, it's a fact, they're a fact of life, and the decision to do nothing is a conscious decision to do nothing, and that has implications as in the same way that doing something has implications too. So that was the kind of background to it. Listening to the colleagues talking now, I've just been, not very scientifically, I'm afraid, but just trying to jot down what seem to be some of the policy questions or dilemmas which have kind of arisen in the discussions today. And I'll just rattle through those quickly. I think there are four possibly 5. One's definitely about the context. So, you know, has in certain contexts, has the conflict context moved on to the point where traditional exits or DDR is no longer possible? And in that kind of context, what do you do? Is the option to do nothing or something? The second thing is probably on objectives. So if you're the government of Nigeria a couple of years ago, then of course your objective was to try to end the insurgency. There was a short-term security imperative, which might mean working with a security actor on the ground makes sense. But of course the longer-term challenge to transition to peace, opposition to government, etc., is clear. So there's a short-term versus long-term thing there. The third thing seems to be about the political economy. So there's this idea of exiting or integration or reintegration. And I think the reality from all the cases that we've studied is that these groups are already deeply integrated. They're just a fact of life on the ground. They exist. And so the idea of exiting is a very challenging concept for most. The fourth thing, very quickly, is on around kind of whose security are you talking about? So obviously these groups provide a function for their communities often. Often that's discriminatory, not for others, i.e. But they're seen as more legitimate maybe than the security actors of the state. So there's a challenge there as to the role that they play and the perceptions that they hold within the community that they represent. And then the final thing, I think, is about this issue around, it's a terrible word, I mean, it's asymmetric engagement. And there's this kind of thing that you certainly see this in northeast Nigeria, where CJTF people will say there are options being offered for people who are involved in the mass exits, for example. We're not really getting many options ourselves, but yet those people who are going through the mass exits are expected to be reintegrated into the places where we provide a security function. And we're the guys who are supposed to be supporting the government, and we don't get as much as the bad guys. So there's that kind of challenge there about how one engages with one part of the security challenge without engaging with the other, and what the implications for longer-term peace and security might be. So those are some of the things that I picked out of the discussion, and what we're going to do, hopefully now in the workshop which follows, is to try and explore those a little bit and try to think through what some of the exit pathways might be, or what some of the opportunities for professionalisation might be, or retaining some sorts of functions. In order, hopefully, to provide, Sven, I don't know if you're going to mention this, but to provide some content for a discussion which is going to take place over the next few weeks, probably, in Lake Chad Basin context.
Great, so thanks so much. We'll elaborate on this in the workshop, and I hand back to Siobhan.